right, so welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive.
Um,
And today we're going back into some familiar territory with D. Terry Yarbrough.
yeah.
You know, he's the retired captain from the Shelby County Sheriff's Department in Memphis.
Yeah, he's really got a knack for making us look at the justice system in some new
He
ways.
does. And, you know, we've talked about his books, Misguided Badges and Blind Democracy,
Uh-huh.
which are both available on Amazon, by the way,
Yeah.
if you want to check those out.
Yes.
And we've even touched on some of his Instagram posts.
Yeah.
But today we're tackling his latest piece, Black Robe Hypocrisy, a systemic injustice.
Okay.
And I got to say, after the conversations we've had about his previous work, I mean, the title alone makes me think this is going to be a pretty intense deep dive.
It is. It's a powerful title, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And it gets right to the heart of his argument,
Okay.
which is that right-wing politics are starting to, seep into our courts.
Okay.
And it's actually threatening that core concept of blind justice.
That we all expect.
All right, so before we go any further, let's make sure everyone's on the same page.
Okay.
You see Lady Justice outside of courthouses all the time,
Right.
blindfolded, holding those scales.
Yeah.
What does that really symbolize?
It's the idea that the law should apply equally to everyone, regardless of wealth, power, background.
Uh-huh.
It's about impartiality, fairness, the idea that everybody gets a fair shake in court.
All right, so Yarbrough is basically saying that this ideal, that's under attack.
Yeah.
And he doesn't mince words, does he? I mean, he uses some really strong language in this piece. Words like perpetual disloyalty, soils the fabric, privileged hypocrisy.
Uh-huh.
It's clear he feels very strongly about this.
He does, absolutely.
Yeah.
He's very passionate about this issue.
Yeah.
And he really wants his readers to feel the weight of it.
Right.
And one of the ways he does that is by focusing on the symbolism of the black robe itself. Yeah, he talks about how that robe is supposed to represent that pure, unbiased application of the law.
Uh-huh.
But he's suggesting it's almost becoming like a costume.
Right.
Hiding something underneath.
Exactly, yeah. It's supposed to represent the law speaking through the judge.
Okay.
Not their own personal opinions or political leanings.
Yeah.
But Yarbrough argues that for some judges, the robe is becoming more of a shield to hide behind than a symbol of impartiality.
Okay, so I'm starting to see why he chose that title, Black Robe Hypocrisy.
Right.
He's making a direct connection between that symbolism of the robe and what he sees as like this betrayal of that symbolism by some judges.
Right.
But I have to ask, how does he back this up?
Okay.
Does he have any concrete examples?
He does, yeah. And this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
He uses this analogy of the fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine.
Uh-huh.
You know how one bad apple can spoil the whole bunch?
Okay.
Well, Yarbrough argues that the same thing can happen in the justice system.
Oh. If you've got a judge that lets their political beliefs influence their decisions, it can taint the entire system.
Wow.
It's not just about that one case. It erodes trust in the whole process.
So even if most judges are doing their best to be fair and impartial, just a few bad apples can really do a lot of damage.
That's why this idea of black robe hypocrisy is so concerning.
Okay.
It's not just about the individual judges. It's about the potential for like a systemic breakdown of justice.
All right, so let's get into some specifics.
Okay.
What kind of real-life examples does he use to illustrate this point?
He mentions this case where a judge and a special prosecutor decide to drop a jury conviction.
Okay.
And Yarbrough questions whether that same leniency would be applied equally across the board, regardless of someone's background or their political connections.
Right.
And it made me think, does everyone really have equal access to that kind of legal privilege?
That's a good question.
And it definitely plays into his concerns about right-wing influence.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. He points to some court rulings from 2024 on issues like presidential immunity, immigration restrictions, anti-abortion measures, open gun carry laws. And he argues that these rulings might have been more about aligning with a certain political agenda than about interpreting the law in a neutral way.
So he's basically saying that in these cases, it seems like the judge's personal political beliefs may have overridden
that's his
their
argument.
commitment to impartiality.
It's important to remember he's not saying that all judges are like this or that everyone on the right is automatically biased.
Right.
But he's raising a red flag about a pattern he's seeing that could have some serious consequences.
Yeah. Okay.
So, And it really, connects back to those themes he explored in Blind Democracy, that hypocrisy can really undermine our institutions and erode public trust.
It's true. He was talking about hypocrisy in a broader sense in that book.
Right.
But here, he's zeroing in on the judiciary and saying, hey, this branch of government is supposed to be the gold standard of impartiality.
Yeah.
And if it's being compromised, that's a huge problem.
Exactly. And what's so fascinating is that even though he's painting a pretty bleak picture, he doesn't just leave us hanging.
Okay.
He offers some ideas about what we can do to push back against this trend and protect that ideal of blind justice.
All right, so let's get into those solutions.
Right.
What does he propose? Does he think we need to, overhaul the entire judicial appointment process or something?
He doesn't go that far.
Okay.
But he does emphasize the need for higher ethical standards among judges. He's saying, look, we all know judges are human beings.
Right.
They have their own beliefs and opinions.
Sure.
But when they put on that robe, they're taking on a huge responsibility.
Yeah.
And they need to hold themselves to a higher standard.
That makes sense, but how do you enforce that?
Right.
I mean, ethics are kind of a gray area, right? It's not like there's a rule book that says, thou shalt not let your political opinions influence your rulings.
True. And Yarbrough acknowledges that he doesn't lay out a step-by-step plan or anything. But he does highlight the importance of public awareness and accountability.
Okay.
Basically saying if we, the people, are more informed about these issues and more willing to call out injustice when we see it, it can create pressure for change from the bottom up.
So it's about citizens being more engaged, more informed, and holding our elected officials.
Right.
And by extension, the judges they appoint.
Exactly.
Accountable. That's a pretty tall order, don't you think?
It is, but he also hints at the need for a more rigorous vetting process for judicial appointments. He doesn't get into specifics, but you can sense that he's suggesting we need to do a better job of making sure that the people who are chosen for these really powerful positions
are truly committed to upholding the law fairly, regardless of their personal political views.
That sounds good in theory, but in our current political climate, with everything so divided and partisan, it's hard to imagine that actually happening.
It definitely won't be easy.
Yeah.
And Yarbrough knows that. He's not being naive about the challenges.
Okay.
But I think his point is that we can't just throw up our hands and say, well, it's too hard, so why bother?
Right.
He seems to believe that if enough people care about this issue, if we keep pushing for reform and demanding better from our leaders, change is possible.
It's funny, because at the beginning of this deep dive, I have to admit I was feeling kind of overwhelmed, maybe even a little pessimistic.
Right.
But now listening to you talk about Yarbrough's ideas, I'm actually feeling like a glimmer of hope.
I get that it's easy to feel powerless when you're talking about these big systemic issues.
Yeah.
But what I appreciate about Yarbrough is that he doesn't let us off the hook.
He reminds us that we all have a role to play in shaping the kind of society we want to live in.
And it's not just about blind faith in the system, right?
Right.
It's about demanding transparency.
Exactly.
Demanding accountability.
Yes.
And making sure that those core principles of justice and fairness are actually being upheld.
Precisely. It's about being active participants in our democracy.
Yeah.
Not passive observers.
Yeah. It really is about taking ownership, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that includes paying attention to what's happening in our courts.
Right.
Which honestly can feel pretty intimidating and inaccessible to most people.
Yeah, I agree. It can feel like this whole other world.
Yeah.
With its own language and rules.
Yeah.
But that's all the more reason why we need to make an effort to understand it.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, the judicial system impacts all of our lives, whether we realize it or not.
That's true. And I think one of the things Yarbrough does so well is connect these abstract legal principles to their real world consequences.
Like, it's not just about some theoretical debate over blind justice.
Exactly.
It's about whether people can trust that they'll be treated fairly in court.
Right.
Regardless of their background or beliefs.
Exactly. And, as we wrap up this conversation, I keep coming back to that question he poses in his piece.
The one about how we can actually ensure that blind justice stays a reality, especially in our current political climate.
Yes, it's $1 million question, and there's no easy answer.
Right.
But I think this deep dive into Yarbrough's work has given us some clues.
Okay.
He really stresses that we need an informed and engaged citizenry. It's not enough to just hope that the system will work as intended.
Right.
We have to be aware of the challenges and willing to speak up when something seems wrong.
So it's not just about being informed, it's about being active. Like not just reading the news, but actually doing something with that knowledge.
Exactly. Democracy isn't a spectator sport.
Right.
It requires us to participate, to hold our leaders accountable.
And to make our voices heard.
And that includes paying attention to who gets appointed to these powerful judicial positions, right?
Absolutely.
Because those decisions have a ripple effect for years to come.
Absolutely. And Yarbrough's work reminds us that we can't just assume those appointments are being made based solely on merit and qualifications.
Right.
We need to be asking tough questions, demanding transparency, and making sure our elected officials are choosing judges who will uphold the principles of justice and fairness that our system is supposed to be built on.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
Yeah.
We've unpacked Yarbrough's arguments about black robe hypocrisy, explored the real-world examples he uses to illustrate his points, and grappled with the question of what we can do to safeguard that ideal of blind justice in these challenging times.
We certainly have, and I hope this deep dive has given you, our listener, plenty to think about.
As always, we encourage you to check out Yarbrough's work for yourself. His books, Misguided Badges and Blind Democracy, offer even more insights into these issues. And you can keep up with his latest thoughts on Instagram.
Yes, he's a powerful voice in these conversations about justice and accountability.
Yeah.
And his work is a great starting point for anyone who wants to understand the challenges facing our judicial system and what we can do to address them.
So keep learning, keep asking questions, and most importantly, stay engaged.
Yes.
Because, as we've heard today, the future of our democracy might just depend on it.